Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sunday. I hope the cliffhanger last week didn't leave you in too bad of shape. Um, I do enjoy it though. Okay, so this is part of my doubleheader on the same week, wearing the same shirt. It says the snuggle is real. And all right, so we're ready for chapter 21, Red Eyes. I was so surprised, I screamed like a blood splattered teen in a whoop. Yeah, okay, we're going. I was so surprised, I screamed like a blood splattered teen in a horror flick. I wasn't expecting that at all, and it freaked me out. My scream must have freaked out Papa Ank too, as he reversed course and started hauling me back up through the hole. That was the exact opposite of what I needed, as the rock thing still had my arm in a grip that was so tight I couldn't twist it. Now that I was being hauled back into the air, my arm and shoulder had a lot more pressure on them, and the whole thing was extremely painful. If the rock thing jerked, or if Papa Ank kept pulling, I stood a good chance of either breaking my arm or having it ripped off. My saving grace was red and all those little hexagons. They were designed so they could take the force in one area and distribute it across my entire body. I had made them when I was facing projectiles, so they worked best when facing a single incoming arrow of force. Consistent pressure like this wasn't their forte, but it seemed that they were fairly good at that too. The flesh in my arm was getting badly bruised, but my reinforced bones were holding out, and I didn't have any cuts. Let go, I mentally snapped at the magic rope as I spike punched at the rock thing as hard as I could. To my surprise, the message got through. The rope untied the knot and uncoiled from my waist. It disappeared back up the hole as gravity took over and I fell down again. My shoulder jerked hard as I came to an abrupt stop, but this time I was ready for it. I thought maybe all my movements and my waist hanging from the mandibles would have made Rock Thing release me, or at least let me slip out of its grip. But that didn't happen. Its hold on my arm stayed rock solid, and my punch didn't seem to phase it at all. I punched it again, but the force I could bring to bear was just pitiful. I wasn't grounded at all, and neither my punch nor my spikes were doing a lot of damage. I was tempted to just hammer at this thing, but now the surprise of the attack had faded, I realized I needed to take a moment and think this through. I dangled by my arm and took a second pass with a magic sight. It all still looked like rocks to me. No wonder I'd missed this on the way down. Now that I knew there was something there, I could spot the creature inside. It was very long, about the length of a school bus, and very flat, with hundreds of short, powerful legs latched onto the roof of the tunnel. It had two smaller stomachs and one long one with crushed up rock digesting inside. This thing is like a cross between a crab and a millipede, my analytical side noted. If I had to guess, it uses its mandibles to crush up the rock, then digests the gravel for food and uses some of the ore it extracts to grow a defensive shell. It probably moves slowly and has few natural predators due to its solid defense. That sounds about right, I agreed. The question is, how do I make it let go of my arm? And does it have red eyes? I looked yet again. This thing didn't have any eyes at all from what I could see. It didn't seem rabid, though. If anything, it seemed peaceful and sleepy. Other than grabbing me, it hadn't moved at all. On the other hand, if this thing ate rocks for a living, I didn't want it chewing on my arm. It was time to make this rock thing realize I was not a tasty morsel. It would also be best if it moved back down the tunnel a bit. I didn't want it grabbing hold of Annabeth when she came through. It's saber saw time, I told Spike, and then focused on exactly what I wanted to cut. I would have preferred to cut the mandibles, but they were too close to my arm. The last thing I needed was to hack off my own limb. The rock thing had a thick ridge of rock protecting its head and eating area. That sounded like an excellent place to start. Hopefully, once I got rid of its defense, I could find a vulnerable spot to make it let go. I sent encouraging thoughts to Spike and the Knuckle crew, but privately I was worried about cutting through stone. If this was wood, bones, or even a really thin sheet of metal, I'd have felt fine. Stone, however, just seemed so freaking hard. I braced myself with my left arm as best as I could and took a swipe, only to shriek in surprise as the rock thing dropped me like a hot potato and slowly started scooching backwards as fast as its multiple legs and massive bulk would allow. That worked out well, my analytical side noted. I think your manly scream scared it away. Either that or it was the vibrations from your new sawing technique. It was a manly shout of joy, I replied primly as I awkwardly landed on my feet. If anything, it was a kia like they do in karate. Sure, we'll go with that story. My analytical side grinned before I dismissed him and sent a message to Annabeth. There was a slight problem down here, I sent, but all is well now. Come on down whenever you're ready. Good, she replied. We were getting pretty worried up here. I'll be down in a moment. While I waited, I rubbed my arm to help it feel better and looked around. Tunnel was quiet, and my eyes were adjusting to the tiny moss lights. And I had a moment to take it all in. I saw there was a lot more vegetation than just moss. There were all kinds of wrinkly things that looked like mushrooms, plants with long leafy things like ferns, and even flowers that reminded me of dandelions. I'd always thought of caves as cold, hard, and lifeless, but the tunnel floor was teeming with its own ecosystem. The walls of the tunnel had vegetation too, but nowhere near as much, and the ceiling was mostly rock. No wonder the rock thing was grazing at the top. It would have had to work a lot harder to get to the tasty rocks at the bottom. I was still full of energy from my encounter, so I paced up and down and swung my arms around to test my shoulder. It was amazing how much better I felt already. I had been fearful it would throw off my fighting ability, but I felt good to go. As always, thank you for taking good care of me, I sent to T and his grove. You guys are the best. I got back happy feelings, and it wasn't long before Annabeth arrived. I had to laugh when she came into view, as she looked like Glinda the Good Witch descending from the sky. The magic rope had gone all out, creating a custom seat for her to sit in as Papa Ank lowered her down the hole. It was an entrance worthy of any production of Wicked, and sitting in her lap, like a species-neutral casting of Toto, was Bermuda. He looked comfortable and sassy and obviously enjoyed the drama of it all. He was the perfect cherry on top of Annabeth's entrance, and I couldn't help but gather him up and give him a warm hug when he got within reach. Then I laid down some loud, snugga-bugga kisses while Bermuda made a face like, "Daddy, please, you're embarrassing me." I could tell he enjoyed all the attention, though. Once Annabeth reached the ground, she called up to Papa Ank to let him know she'd arrived. He released the rope, which fell down to us. He wished us luck on our quest and said he'd stay around for a few minutes in case we needed him. I yelled up that I appreciated everything he and Ank Jr. had done for us. Meanwhile, Bermuda decided I was being too noisy and jumped out of my arms. He started sniffing around the mushroom-type things as Annabeth gave me a mandatory hug and then jumped up on my back again. The rope got to work tying us together, and it wasn't long before we were ready to begin the underground portion of our adventure. While I did that, I decided to summon at least one of all my normal soul creations. I had no idea what we were going to run into down here, but it took less effort in the middle of the battle to duplicate them than it did to summon them in the first place. I summoned the head greenie godmother, who gave me a big smile and a double dustbuster salute. She would be a lifesaver if we ran into any toxic magic. Then I summoned my main flying miner, who blinked his helmet light at me before zooming off with his rocket backpack. I didn't have anything he needed to break up at the moment, but we were surrounded by stone, so there was a good chance he'd be useful. I summoned an Ass Blaster 2000 as well. That little guy could move a surprising amount of dirt and rocks, considering his size. He gave me a happy belch and then farted his way after his buddy, the miner. Octa the purple octopus was next, and she batted her pretty eyes at me before swimming off to hang with her friend, the godmother. Bob the Basher, who was my maid shield tester, was already present. He didn't need it, but I gave him a refill anyway, and he thumped my shoulder in appreciation. My 10 surfer dudes were always with me, keeping an eye out for danger, and I gave them refills as well. They gave me a loop-de-loop in the air to show they were ready and zoomed away. The next summons was my trusty flasher. The little firefly with a massive amount of light in his butt had saved me more than once. I briefly debated creating several flashers and letting them light up the tunnel, but Annabeth was blind and I could already see just fine using moss light. Using my flasher as a surprise attack if we ran into mages would be a much better use of his abilities. He gave a tiny twinkle in greeting and then flew up over my head. That was a great default position, as he could probably blind anyone looking at me, but he wouldn't ruin my own eyesight. My final creation was Belcher the Blowfish. It takes him a moment to compress the air and get charged up, but when he's ready, he can make a lot of noise. Given the acoustics down here, the Belcher might be extra effective. He gave me a soft burp in greeting and then swam off to hang with Octa. Summoning these creations sounded like it should take a while, but Penny kept a template of all my little helpers, so it was a lot easier than it used to be. One silver lining of being trapped in stone in Carl's cave was that I'd gotten very proficient in summoning, duplicating, and refilling multiple helpers at once. Plus, my templates were at a much higher definition and much more powerful than they used to be. Basically, I flexed my magic and all my soul creations sprang into being and did their thing at about the same time as the magic rope took to tie Annabeth on like a comfortable backpack. I took a moment to appreciate my accomplishments. I come a long way from the mage who'd struggled at summoning a punch rocket to push an elevator button. "Where to now?" Annabeth asked aloud. I've been wondering about that myself, but before I could say anything, I heard the faint sounds of something coming towards us. It sounded fast, like something was running. But it wasn't any type of running sound I recognized. Annabeth stayed quiet and gripped my shoulder in support as we moved to the side of the tunnel and faced the sound. We didn't have long to wait until I saw the faint outline of a shape heading towards us. It was about the size of a golden retriever, so it didn't seem scary at first. Then I realized it wasn't moving like any type of dog I knew. Wait, was that a spider? God, I hope not. I hated spiders. Hated them. I hated their furry legs, their beady eyes, their sticky webs. Ooh. Ever since I got trapped in a crawl space under my parents' house, I hated them. They'd swarmed all over me as I'd screamed in helpless fear. One had even crawled in my mouth. Just thinking about it made me shudder and break out in goosebumps. I know they're good for the environment and all, but I don't want any spiders near me, ever. No, thank you. Wait, it was an ant, a black ant. That was better. I'm not sure how much better that is, my analytical side noted. They still have 6 legs and move like a spider. It's much better, I replied firmly. Ants are like workers. They're nice. They're the good guys. Ants can also sting you, my analytical side continued. Plus, they're crazy strong. They can lift over 10 times their own body weight. I know you're not as scared of ants, but you should still be on your guard. This insect might be looking for food for its freshly hatched babies. It might just decide you're a tasty snack and drag you back to the nest like you're a discarded Dorito. I don't think you wanted to be treated like a tasty potato chip. First, you have a weird mind, I retorted, but I get what you're saying. Don't worry. I'll be wary of anything we meet down here, no matter how innocent it seems. The ant ran towards us, and I was shocked at just how fast it was moving. It might have been the size of a medium dog, but it was arriving much faster than any dog I'd ever seen. I would have thought that it would have been slower, as it had 6 legs to maneuver, but I realized its strides were much longer than a canine's. Its legs went up and then bent back down again, like a cricket, giving it a deceptively long reach. The ant saw us and started running on the opposite side of the tunnel, so it would miss us. We were here for points, but I breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed like it didn't want to fight us. Plus, I wasn't seeing red eyes, so it wouldn't have given us any points anyway. The ant ran right up until it was even with us, then it stopped. It didn't skid to a stop or slow down. It just stopped. We need to be careful, I sent a quick thought to Annabeth. We're used to normal creatures on the surface. These insects won't react the way I think they should. They're moving much faster, and they seem more agile than expected. Annabeth didn't say anything out loud, but she sent a quick message of agreement. But she sent back a quick message of agreement. The ant waved around a pair of antennas that were almost as long as my arm, then took off running again. As it scuttled away, I saw more ants headed towards us. Do you think this is normal? Annabeth whispered. Or are they being chased? I think we're about to find out, I replied. This time there were 3 ants, and Annabeth was right. They were being chased. Behind them was a larger ant with red eyes. It wasn't that much bigger, about as tall as my waist, and I would have thought that 3 black ants could have taken it down. They seemed to be running for their lives, though, so maybe there was something I was missing. How do you want to handle this? Annabeth asked. But before I could reply, the 3 ants had zoomed past us. Suddenly, our first red eye was in front of us, and I felt waves of killing intent rolling off of it. From a distance, it wasn't that intimidating. Up close, I felt like a scared little rabbit getting ready to get splattered into roadkill. It only came up to my waist, but it was much longer and more dangerous looking than I expected. Its 6 legs suddenly seemed very spider-like, and its red eyes seemed crazy. Like Joker fresh out of the asylum crazy. Like zombie spider, I'm going to eat your brains crazy. Fortunately, I didn't have long to be scared, as it didn't even try to slow down and figure out what I was. It just opened its mandibles wide and charged right at me. Incoming, I hollered at Annabeth and started punching before it even arrived. It was a good thing I did, as it rushed at us at what seemed like sonic speed. It came to an abrupt stop a few inches in front of me and tried to take a bite out of my stomach. Fortunately, my fist got there first, and I knocked its head out of the way. It didn't seem fazed at all. Instead, it snapped its head back into position and tried to take another bite. That's when Annabeth's shillelagh landed and knocked its head down so hard it bounced off the ground. Again, Red Eyes wasn't stunned and just kept on coming. We're only facing 1 ant, I yelled. So we need to see what works with these things before we face a whole swarm of them. Agreed, Annabeth yelled back, and together we let loose. We quickly found out that blunt force wasn't very effective. My fists would knock its head around, which was good for defense, but I couldn't knock it backward to give us some room. It had a lower center of gravity than we did, and its 6 legs gave it a lot more stability. I also couldn't pigeon step to dodge like I was used to. Again, 6 legs trumps 2. The rabbit ant could turn on a dime. The only thing that seemed to be effective at all was just to center myself on the earth. Was just centering myself The only thing that seemed to be effective at all was to just center myself in the earth and hammer away at the enemy. Annabeth was getting her shots in too. We weren't sure how her over-the-shoulder blows would work in a real fight, and I was very happy to know that she laid down some thumpers. She wasn't hitting as hard as she would have if she'd been standing on her own, but she was doing a lot more than knocking politely. The problem was that the ant had a head like a goat. It was all forehead, and it could obviously take a licking and keep on ticking. The mandibles weren't to be discounted either. They were massive, as long as short swords, and it used them to defend as much as attack. I was very glad I had Red and all his hexagons shielding me. If those mandibles ever got a good bite, I was going to be hurting. Bashing sucks, Annabeth called, switching to cutting. I nodded and kept defending. Her short swords didn't do a lot of good either. His chittering was tough and smooth, and unless Annabeth hit it just right, her sword slid right off. She managed to crack its shell in a few places, but it would take a lot of time and luck to take this red eye down. I can go for the eyes and antennas, Annabeth suggested, but I shook my head. Let's see how my spikes do first, I replied. I got in 2 spike punches before the red eye went even more crazy. My needle-sharp spikes, backed by the power of grounded punches, easily shattered its chitin and stabbed deep into its head. The red eye stopped trying to bite and instead used its 2 front legs to grab Annabeth. It jerked backwards and almost ripped Annabeth off my back. The sudden pull forward was completely surprising, and for a moment, I was off balance. The red eye used that moment of weakness to lunge forward. This time, it was aiming to crush my head. That was enough. Testing time was over. The front 2 legs had a solid grip on Annabeth, and she used that stability to cut both of them off with a double swipe of her short swords. Meanwhile, I switched from spikes to saber saw and cut through both sides of its grasping mandibles. I thought it would run away, or at least rear back in pain, but instead it lowered its head and tried to run us over. This thing really was crazy. It didn't seem to have any self-preservation instincts at all. It just wanted to tear us apart. It seemed like if it could use its last flicker of life to destroy us, then it would die happy. I already knew it could move its head around, so I used a punch to knock its head down into the side. That gave me access to one of the smallest parts of its anatomy, its neck. I stepped in, and 1 saber saw later, its head fell to the ground. Wow, that was intense, Annabeth said as I stepped back. Then we both freaked out as the body of the ant kept moving. It walked back like it was going to run away before slowly sinking to the ground like a balloon, slowly losing its helium. We both stayed alert, ready to fight again. I didn't feel like we'd won until the legs relaxed and stretched out on the ground. A red haze that I hadn't even noticed was present, finally lifted, and for the first time, the ant looked truly lifeless. Even in death, it looked menacing. I hadn't realized before just how big it was. Its body was as long as a full-size SUV, and its legs were as long as its body. No wonder it had such stability and it moved so quickly. That thing is built like a tank, Annabeth continued, echoing my train of thought. For real, I agreed. I wonder how the other teams are doing against red eyes like this. I would imagine they're struggling, Annabeth said. It was fast and fearless, so teams probably wouldn't have much time to figure it out. If they're using regular magical weapons, I can't imagine they'll do any better than I did. My sword and shillelagh didn't seem to hurt it much at all. The only other solution I could think of that might be effective is to use pure magic attacks like fire or tear it apart with vines or something like that. That weird life-sapping glow the Fists of the Desert used might have been good against these things, I agreed. However, attacks like that use up a lot of magic. They might be effective against a few, but if they face several red ants, they're going to be in trouble. Switching topics. Did you notice a red glow around this ant? It wasn't just its eyes. It was around all of it, like its aura had turned red. I don't see magic like you do, Annabeth reminded me. Only its eyes look slightly red to me. Otherwise, it just looks like a big black ant. I could hear it, though, and it sounded awful. She made a face of disgust. It sounded like fingernails on a chalkboard crossed with screeching brakes from a train. Wow, I said thoughtfully. I keep forgetting how old you are. You probably had real chalkboards when you grew up, didn't you? I was teasing her to try and lighten the mood. Fighting crazy giant insects in the dark was crazy stuff. You better behave yourself, young whippersnapper. Annabeth laughed and lightly thumped me on the head. I might have grown up with chalk instead of a touchscreen, but this old granny has still got it. Yes, you do. I laughed with her and gave her leg a pat. Then I looked at the body again in the dim light. I thought ants had smooth exoskeletons, like armor. This thing has bristles or spikes or something like that all over it. It's kind of like the rats at Otug's warehouse, Annabeth agreed. I wonder if all underground creatures have something like this. Do you think they're sharp? I don't know, I replied. Its head was right by my feet, so I looked down and saw there were a few bristles in the back, where its neck used to be. The whole hair on the legs thing reminded me of spiders, which was just nasty. But I decided to be brave and touched a hair to see what it felt like. I knelt down and carefully reached out to touch a spiky projection. Boo! Annabeth hollered and grabbed my shoulders. I screamed like a startled cat and just about shit my pants. I swear I jumped at least 4 feet off the ground as I screamed again. Don't do that, I yelled, smacking her leg as Annabeth laughed hysterically. That wasn't funny. Oh, it was funny, Annabeth howled. Believe me, it was very funny. She mimicked me almost touching the bristle and freaking out. Then she started laughing all over again. Annabeth is such a sweet soul, but she can be mischievous sometimes. My heart was still racing and I had goosebumps on top of goosebumps. I grumbled at her as I walked around trying to get rid of the excess energy. Oh, Jason, don't be mad. Annabeth gave me a big hug. You just seemed very tense and I thought I would lighten the mood. You almost caused me to make a gravy stain on my new super suit, I grumbled. There's lightening the mood and then there's giving me a heart attack. I swear, I thought I was going to die. I got you good, Annabeth stated proudly. Then I got another hug. You got me good, I agreed. It was hard to stay mad at her, and I was calming down a bit. It's just that I don't like bugs. I don't like their crunchy shells. I don't like the creepy way they walk. I don't like their hairy legs, and I don't like their buggy eyes. I just flat out don't like them. I'm beginning to get that, Annabeth laughed. Give me a sweet furry cat any day of the week, I said. Sure, they can pee in your shoes and yak on the rug, but they're so darn cute when they do it. Speaking of which, where is Bermuda? I looked around and Bermuda was off to the side, chewing on a flower. He seemed totally unconcerned with red ants or my near heart attack. Come here, cat, I said as I walked over and picked him up. You're supposed to be my emotional support animal, so support me, damn it. He looked at me like, Daddy, what are you doing? I was busy. But then he resigned himself to his fate and looked at my face a few times. It seems like he did it more out of obligation than anything else, as he then wriggled for me to put him down again. I sighed, gave him a few kisses of my own, and put him back on the ground. I love you, you little rascal, I told him. He gave me a cheerful look like, I know you do. Now run along and play with your monsters like a good human. Since this ant was a red-eye, shouldn't we be collecting our points? Annabeth asked to get us back on track. Good idea, I said, and went over and gently tapped my bank stamp against the dead ant's head. It disappeared with a pop. I looked at the long hairy body, but it was still there. I walked over and gently tapped my bank stamp against its neck. The body also disappeared with a pop. Did I just get double points? I asked my bank crystal hopefully. Nope, it replied, it was only one enemy. So you can only receive the allotted amount of points for a red-eye soldier ant. And how many points was that? I inquired. 20 points, it replied, which is pretty good overall. You'll only need to vanquish 5 of them to get 100 points, which is more than many teams from the last round. 20 points didn't seem like a lot to me, especially when we were 7,000 points in the hole. I started to tell Annabeth about it when we heard the sounds of movement coming down the tunnel. Incoming, Annabeth said, and I moved to the side of the tunnel and got ready for our next fight. Letting the black ants run past me and taking out whoever was chasing him had already worked once. Maybe it would work again. The shape got closer, and this time looked like a single black worker ant being chased by a red-eyed soldier. The worker was running with everything he had, but the soldier was fast, and before they reached us, the soldier caught up to him. The red-eyed mandibles tried to bite the worker's rear end, but the worker dodged at the last moment and it missed. The evasion cost was necessary, but it slowed the worker down and let the soldier get even closer. It attacked again, but this time the soldier used its jaws to get under the worker and flip it off its feet. Immediately a desperate struggle ensued, with the worker on his back, trying with all his might to fend off the red-eye's relentless advance. His legs pushed frantically against the soldier's head as his body slid along the ground. "Go!" Annabeth cried, gripping my shoulders hard. "Stop him!" I was already in motion, sprinting as fast as I could towards the worker, fighting for his life. It wasn't really a fight, though, as it wasn't something the worker could win. The red-eyed soldier was bigger, stronger, and much more aggressive. Even as frantically as the worker defended himself, I knew it wouldn't be enough. I was still strides away when the enemy soldier grabbed one of the worker's back legs and ripped it off. The violence was shocking. I felt the intensity of their battle in my soul. This wasn't movie violence. This wasn't a fight for fame or status. This wasn't a fight for glory in front of a crowd. Instead, this struggle was life and death. This was one ant determined to end the life of another. What made the whole thing feel eerie and surreal was that there were almost no sounds. There wasn't any cussing or screams or cry for help. There was just the soft sounds of their scuffle on the quiet moss. The worker never stopped fighting. Its 5 remaining legs struggled all they could. Annabeth felt the intensity too, as she screamed a battle cry and urged me to move faster. The red-eyed soldier clamped down another one of the worker's legs just as we arrived. This time we didn't play around. I ran past, slashed at the red-eye's mandibles, and cut them off. Annabeth sliced into its antenna and stabbed it through the eye. It reared back and focused all its attention on us, but that didn't matter as I raced past its head and reached its neck. I felt like a Jedi, striking a blow against pure evil as my saber saw sliced through its tiny neck. And just like that, the battle was over. I bank-stamped its headless body before it could wander away, and then got rid of the severed head too. I spun around to see how the worker was doing, but it had already gotten to its feet. For a long moment we just looked at each other, and once again the whole thing felt strange. The poor ant had just lost a leg, and yet it wasn't crying or whimpering at all. It had also just fought for its life with everything it had, and yet it wasn't panting or doing any of the other signs I'd recognize as having been through an intense struggle. Instead, it just stood there, like it was reporting for duty. Somehow that made the whole fight seem even more intense. Life in the underground was no joke. It was kill or be killed, and it better not take long to recover. The only thing about the ant that seemed to betray an appropriate level of agitation was its antenna. They were waving around like it was conducting 2 orchestras at once. "Poor thing," Annabeth said. "It must be scared. I can't believe it's back on its feet already. Can you put its leg back on?" I looked around and saw its leg on the ground, but it looked pretty mangled. When the soldier had ripped it off, he must have twisted its head, as the leg was both crushed and bent at a steep angle. "I don't think I can," I replied. "Even if I could get it to reattach, it wouldn't do any good. That leg is ruined." "It has to be in pain, though," Annabeth continued. "Can you at least do something for that?" "I'll try," I said, and took a tentative step forward. The worker immediately took a step back. Annabeth made soothing noises, and I slowly stepped forward again. This time it didn't move. As soon as I took a second step, though, it took another step back. Its steps were bigger than mine, so although I'd taken an extra step, I still wasn't any closer. At least it wasn't running away. Annabeth kept talking to it, like it was an injured cat on the street, but it wouldn't let down its guard. I could get about 2 strides away from touching it, but no closer. I don't think we can do anything, I said regretfully. I want to help him too, but I think we are going to have to move on. I agree with you, Annabeth said slowly, but she said it in a tone like she didn't really feel that way at all. But, I asked. It doesn't feel right, Annabeth replied. Logically, you are certainly correct. We've never seen this ant before, and we probably never will again. We need to get going, find some more red eyes, and work on our points. I agree with all that. It's just that I feel this is important. I don't know why, and I can't tell you how this will change things. It's just a feeling, but it's like fate is telling me we should take the time to help this ant. I nodded in agreement, although I was feeling resigned. I trusted Annabeth's feelings like I trusted my own. My hunches had saved my life before by allowing my magic to grow in unexpected ways. I wanted to help this worker ant just like I wanted to help any injured animal, but it was wary of us, and even with 5 legs, it was still much faster. If it didn't want us to touch it, then I wouldn't be able to, at least not without hurting it, and that would defeat the whole point of touching it in the first place. Do you think you can help this ant? I asked T. If so, I could always fly a member of your grove over. T looked thoughtful for a minute as his healing flowers waved in an imaginary wind. Then he shook his head. I don't have his permission to work on him, so it'd be very difficult to make any changes. He isn't a magical creature, so he has a regular weak aura. Your aura is powerful, so you could probably override his natural defenses and give me a smaller amount of room to work. You'd need to touch him for that, though. Besides, healing works best when it's working with the body. I like to help the body help itself. To make this even more difficult, this ant has an exoskeleton, which isn't something I've worked with before. I don't think he has anything like a human heart or lungs or even blood. Figuring out how he operates without his permission would be an impossible task. He gave me a deep bow, and I could feel his sadness and frustration. T loved being a healer, and he didn't like it that he wasn't able to help. Okay, I replied, thank you. I passed on what T had said to Annabeth. Well, shoot, she said. I was hoping we could do something, but he doesn't seem to be responding to me at all. She sighed, and we turned to go, and suddenly I had an idea. I just learned about the power of connection and place from my Mark of the Deep Earth, and so I was thinking of it as a skill that worked with stone, or maybe plants through my Mark of the Lagarelle. This wasn't a skill for my marks, though. This was a skill that I had from being alive, from being magical, part of the fabric of creation. I had already used it on a sentient being when I had connected with the dummy at Wet's Edge. Sure, it had a stone at its center, but I'd done a lot more than feel its core. I'd connected with it on the fundamental level and measured who I was against who it was. Maybe the same thing would work here? I'm going to try something, I said to Annabeth as I grounded myself on the floor of the tunnel. I tuned in completely to my magical senses and connected to the stone all around me. That wasn't as hard to do, as I'd already been paying much more attention than usual to my magic sight. The minerals and ore around me came into sharp focus, and I heard their whispers and gentle melodies as they slowly communicated with each other. The stones weren't in a big hurry. It had been there long before I'd arrived, and it would be here long after I left. I connected to the stone, and its unhurried permanence helped ground me for my next step. Now I was in the right frame of mind. I turned my attention to the worker ant. T was right. Its aura was weak. Or maybe I was just getting stronger. Either way, its aura blocked my view, but nowhere near as much as I expected. I could see its internal organs, its physical makeup, and it was so different from anything I was used to. I wasn't here to study him physically, so with the small effort of will, I created our connection. The worker ant was wary, so there was resistance at first, but as the connection settled into place, he started thinking of me as a magical ant, and a whole new world opened up. I thought of myself as very lucky to have my housemates as close friends. His family, however, numbered in the thousands, and they were family on a level beyond any actual family I'd known. They were his relatives, his friends, his co-workers. He was part of a clan whose members supported each other in every way possible. They shared food, raised their young, and fought their enemies, and they did it in harmony and connection with each other. To feel that from the worker was inspiring and humbling all at the same time. I also sensed that there had been ants before that had developed their magical abilities. That didn't happen often, but when it did, they became known as special worker ants. The others in the family took care of them, and in turn, they used their magical talents for the good of the clan. The worker ant didn't have a reference for anyone as an individual, as I was, so he began to think of me as a strange magical ant, and that opened up a whole new level of information. Basically, the family was in trouble. They had a territory they thought of as their own, and they often fought with other creatures of the underground for dominance and food. Sometimes they won, in which case they hauled the intruder back to their nest and ate them. Sometimes they lost, and in turn the enemy would put them on their supper menu as well. This was all normal, as nothing was wasted in the underground. What wasn't normal were the red-eyed creatures that had shown up. They fought, and it wasn't for food or survival. Instead, they fought and fought, destroying anything and everything they could. The clan battled back, of course, but the red-eyed ants were stronger, faster, and seemed to feel no pain. The only way to stop them was to tear them apart, making sure they were completely dead. The worst part was that sometimes members of the clan became infected, and they turned into red-eyed ants too. They still smelled like family, but now they were crazy and did everything they could to kill their former friends. The family was everything to the worker ant. He worked every day, all day, to provide for his clan and keep his people strong. He'd gladly die for his family if it would keep them safe. The thought of turning against them was his worst nightmare. It was the antithesis of who he was, who every black ant was, and the conversions had the entire family freaking out. None of the ants had any idea how to deal with this new threat, so they continued to do what they had done before. They raised soldiers to protect the nest, even though they weren't strong enough. They bred workers to search for food, even though they weren't fast enough to escape. They worked, they fought, and they hoped for a miracle. I bundled this all up as best as I could, and I sent it to Annabeth. Then I used my connection with the ant to get more specific. This time I didn't focus on his family or his situation. Instead, I focused on his physical abilities. Connection was about knowing how two entities measure up against each other. For rocks, it was all about place, pressure, temperature, composition. For the ant, it was all about who could move more, and in that instance, he could run circles around me. He could lift so much more than I could and run so much faster. His endurance was astonishing as he worked constantly and only slept for a few hours every day. His dedication to the family and his work ethic was astonishing. Most of all, he was happy. So very happy to be doing everything he could for his tribe. Connection allows the two parties to grow and learn from each other. And in this case, I became inspired by his ability to work and not stop. I thought I trained hard before, but I had a whole new benchmark now. The next time I trained on the beach, I was going to attack it like an ant. Connections hold up a mirror. It allowed me to see myself in a whole new light. I was both flattered and worried about what I saw. My intelligence and my ability to see the world in new ways was far beyond what the simple worker could understand. Its life was simple, and it loved that simplicity. My life wasn't simple at all, and I wasn't sure I loved how complex it had become. Obviously, I was way more magical than the ant, but what that highlighted for me was that it turned me into a deadly fighter, a killer. I had created weapons that could destroy my opponents, but the worker ant didn't see that as a problem. To him, I was a soldier ant, fighting to the death for my family and those I loved. I was also a healer, and apparently there were healer ants too. They couldn't restore lost legs, but they took care of injured ants and helped restore minor injuries. It was interesting because none of my abilities were good or bad. As long as they were true to my clan and used my and as long as I was true to my clan and used my abilities for their benefit, then all was right in the view of the ant. It was an interesting perspective and something I'd have to think about later. In the meantime, I finally got the ant's permission to heal him. I stepped forward and touched his head and transferred a couple of T's ants. They went to work right away as I continued to realize just how different this worker was from myself. It wasn't just that he had an exoskeleton, which was like having his bones on the outside. It was also that he mainly communicated by scent and using his antennas. His eyes were on the side, giving him a very different vision than I experienced, and he had a version of hearing, but it was mainly about sensing enemies through vibrations in the air. It wasn't used at all to communicate like we did. No wonder he hadn't responded to Annabeth's overtures. The two ants seemed to spend a long time learning how the ant worked, and time wasn't something we had a lot of. We waited for a while before T suggested sending over more ants. I doubled their number before, waited again, then doubled their number to 8. Finally, I sent T himself over to speed things up. I was leery about letting T out of my body, as he was my sole creation that had been around the longest, and he was responsible for my personal health. If something happened, I wasn't sure I could recreate him. He had always been an independent thinker, but when he'd taken the healing rune and turned it into flowers, he had somehow become a medical genius. The other members of his grove were copies of himself, and they did an amazing job, but they weren't the original T. He was one of a kind. Even with T on the job, it still took another couple minutes for them to finish mapping out the worker ant. Once they did, the healing happened pretty quickly. They couldn't regrow a new leg for the worker, but they fixed him up in every other way. As they all merged back into my hand again, T assured me that our new friend wasn't in any pain, and he was now stronger and faster than before. Jason, this is just amazing, Annabeth exclaimed. My bank crystal had been sending her messages with my images and feelings, so she remained caught up on all developments. I'm sure it wasn't the same as experiencing it firsthand, but it still had to have been pretty exciting. It wasn't every day you get to experience life as an ant. She was going to say more, but I heard the faint scuffling sounds of something incoming. We turned to look and saw 3 red eyes headed our way. Get out of here, I tried to send to the worker. You're not a fighter, and I don't want you to get hurt again. We'll take care of them. I wasn't sure if he got the message or not, but at least he backed off and retreated down the tunnel a ways. I couldn't focus on him anymore. Though, so I dropped our connection and got ready for our latest enemies. Okay, backpack buddy, I called up to Annabeth. Are you ready to do this? I'm packing and wrapping, she called back, brandishing her shillelaghs as she gave me a squeeze with her legs. Let's go smash some crazies. Giddy up. I laughed and made clop-clop noises as I started jogging down the tunnel. I sent a quick mental tug to Bermuda, but he was still very interested in the flowers. I guess they must taste good or something. I was disappointed that he didn't want to join in the fight. I always felt safer with him around. I didn't have time to dwell on that, as the battle started sooner than I expected. I was feeling pretty good about our chances until it occurred to me that this time they weren't chasing anyone. This time, we were their entire focus. That made a huge difference, as the fight went to hell almost right away. The red eye in the center came the red eye in the center came straight at me, mandibles wide and ready to bite me in two. The red eye on the right closed in and went for Annabeth. She thunked his head into the ground as I spike punched the center ant and stopped him cold. I wanted I wanted to cut off his mandibles, but he was coming in too fast, and if I didn't stop him, he was going to run over me. All that would have been great if there were only two ants, but there were three of them, and the ant on the left was more battle savvy than the other two. Instead of going for my body and my arms, he went for my feet. His jaws closed around my left ankle, and I had enough time to think, oh shit, before I was hauled into the air. He flung his head, and for a moment I thought he'd let go and we'd slam into the wall. I was prepared for impact, but instead what he did was much worse. Rather than letting go, he whipped his head back the other way. My spine popped like a bullwhip as the centrifugal force generated by Annabeth's extra mass almost tore me in half. I've never felt anything like it before and never wanted to again. I don't know what hurt worse, my ankle or my back. The wind swallowed my cries as the ant whipped us back again. The two other ants backed off as he shook me like a dog playing with a chew toy. I wasn't the only one howling in pain and terror. Annabeth was screaming right along with me. In some ways, it was probably worse as her head was the tip of the whip. I'm sure her head was feeling even more pressure than mine. I was moving so fast I couldn't think. I had enough presence of mind to try and bend over to cut myself loose from its jaws, but the centrifugal force, multiplied by Annabeth's weight on my back, was too much to overcome. On the other hand, I couldn't let Annabeth go as she'd fly off, smack into a wall, and then get hit, and then get attacked by the remaining two ants. She'd be stunned and still couldn't see. She would be a sitting duck. On top of all the pain and pressure, I was getting hit with a massive wave of vertigo. My magic sight was fantastic in normal situations, but it made me very dizzy if I got spun around unexpectedly. I gotten better at dealing with it, but getting whipped around like this was outside of everything I trained for. My puking reflexes kicked in, and suddenly I wanted to toss my cookies like a gay boy drinking shots for the first time. I had a vision of chunky stomach juices shooting out my mouth and all over my face, and then all over Annabeth. That was beyond gross. The situation looked hopeless and it was only getting worse. So I did the only thing I could think of. I clamped my jaws shut and sent out the call to my soul creations. And we will pick up here next week. See you guys then.